Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Resistance Recovery Book Club. We are in book number 4, and I'm joined by my very dear friend, Kevin Martin. He and I have both read a very interesting book that we can talk about this, may not wind up being read by very many people. And it is called 16 Maps of Hell by Jasun Horsley, The Unraveling of the Hollywood Superculture. And if you can see on the cover, you've got a picture of Roman Polanski with a blade. And then on the back, you got a picture of one of my favorites, Charlie. So, the reason this book might not be read by many people is that Jasun could not find a publisher. And after a while, he, rather than look for one, continue to look for one, he decided to do a fundraiser for the book instead. And that's how the book came about. So I don't know, the information's available, but I don't know how many copies have been made of this. So Kevin, let's just start off with you describing what you think the book is about.
Well, I mean, I think the book's a lot about about a lot of different things, but in particular, I think it's diagnostic of culture, where we are now, kind of how we got here, and what it means when there's no real difference between top-down and bottom-up movements, because they've all kind of been infiltrated, co-opted, and, for lack of a better word, programmed by the same kind of rampant ideology.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I said to him when I last talked to him, I said, the book leaves you feeling like you had been initiated into somebody else's trauma cult, but initiated unwittingly. Yeah?
Yeah.
And he's paying special attention to the way Hollywood does this. And so the book's really kind of interesting because he takes you to a lot of your heroes, a lot of people that you absolutely love. And he starts unpacking things about their professional history and their personal lives that are either pretty disturbing or don't really add up. Was there anybody in there like that really got you, that really shocked you?
Cohen.
Leonard Cohen, yeah.
Leonard Cohen really got me.
So maybe we should just unpack that a little bit, some of the things about Cohen. So what were some of the things that really kind of weirded you out?
Well, if you take a look at, Jasun did some really remarkable research. He went pretty far back. So Cohen's father and grandfather they made their money doing mercantile stuff, pretty much?
I think the grandfather did, yeah.
So he comes from old money, and it was really interesting to see his connection with Cameron Ewing. So he gets put in. I don't know if it was Stanford or if it was McGill.
It was McGill.
It was McGill, but he gets put into these experiments, these sensory deprivation experiments, and Horsley kind of goes through how that kind of an experience can put you in what he calls a trauma trance. It can make you very susceptible to programming.
Just to interrupt you, these were sensory deprivation experiments that were funded by MK Ultra, which was a CIA program. And they were done in Canada because it was illegal to do them on American citizens. So for those of you who don't know who Ewan Cameron is, he was, for a period of time, probably the most prominent psychiatrist in the world, head of both the Canadian and the American psychiatric societies.
And then he got access to, he ended up in Boston, right? At a psych hospital down there. Or no, he was at Mass General. He was doing the same things down there.
You mean,
so he does make it over.
Yeah. Yeah, it does. Makes it to Vermont too. Yeah, so he's this guy who his family has connections with the mafia in Montreal, and including the Bronfman family, who made their money in prohibition smuggling Seagram's whiskey to the United States. Now, this is the same Bronfman family whose one of the heiresses has recently been implicated in the Nexium cult. So Edgar Bronfman, pretty dark guy, and Cohen wants to be a poet, and he starts out as a poet. But what's really interesting is some of the poetry is just, off the charts sinister. So I don't know if I have it right here. I should be able to find it. Well, at any rate, a lot of this information that he gets is from a 4-hour interview, and there were later interviews with a former lover of Leonard Cohen's, who was a woman named Ann Diamond. Anyway, go on. What else do you noticing about him?
Well, if you take a look at him kind of traveling back and forth to Israel, and he went to Cuba, he went to South America, but he went there at all these really interesting times when the Red Scare was happening, and what Horsley's kind of getting at is that Cohen was a spy, more or less, is what he's saying.
Well, he's definitely an operative. So
Right.
The stuff with Cuba is particularly fascinating because he was detained on the beach just before
Bay of Pigs.
And he managed to get out of there by the skin of his teeth.
Right.
Then he was also in Israel before just before the 7 days war, 6 days. I can.
War, yeah.
Yeah. And so he's got this. So far, what have we described? We described the guy who comes from a family that has at least ties to organized crime. He volunteers for MK Ultra experiments, which are designed for programming. He struggles to be a poet, doesn't really make it as a poet, but during those same years, he's getting
contract after contract,
contracts and scholarships, and he's going around the world to these places that ostensibly don't have much to do with poetry, but they're hotspots in the Cold War.
Right.
And then he emerges. He gets some acting gigs. They're all pretty small, and then he starts actually getting. He reinvents himself as a singer.
Right.
And one of the things that was just so striking was, almost immediately he's at the Chelsea Hotel in New York City, and he's hanging out with the Warhol Factory, and he's hanging out with Jimi Hendrix.
And Joplin.
He writes a song that Judy Collins records and becomes a hit, so he's writing, he wrote Suzanne.
Right, his first big hit was Suzanne.
Yeah, that's right. And then there's this very, very strange statement where there's this concert on the Isle of Wight, which I suppose is up by Scotland. And he has a band called the Army.
Yeah.
During Vietnam, and he actually salutes the crowd. And Diamond says, this is Horsley, when Diamond first saw Cohen perform, she and her friends, she told me, went into a trance state. She also claims that Cohen's hypnotic stage talents were able to calm down an unruly crowd at the Isle of Wight Festival in 1970. After which Chris Christopherson allegedly said, "Leonard's our boy." Diamond also believes Christopherson was an undercover operative. And then he does go into some of Christopherson's background, which is heavily military family anyway. So here's this guy, and then he starts being this, he becomes like a sainted figure to all of us.
Right.
By the time he's close to death, we can't get enough of Leonard Cohen. And we're grieving the icon that's about to shed his mortal coil.
Right. Now, Horsley kind of indicates that Cohen and his family might have been part of that Sabian cult or Sabbatean cult.
Yeah, well, that's interesting that Horsley put that in there, because that's one of those hot button issues, that a lot of people say there's no such thing, and other people say it's the thing that is implicated in all this child ritual stuff. What he does do that's, I was almost a little taken aback that he put that there. But what he does do is he quotes a whole bunch of lyrics from songs that are just, in this context, they're suddenly so different.
Right, Cohen is telling you what he's doing.
Yeah. So, dear mailer, should I suffer the smallest humiliation at your hand, I will kill you and your entire family. Another one called Stay. What embrace satisfies the child who will not kill? Disguises. You had to open little boys with a penknife.
Right.
I loved your statement to the press. I didn't think he'd mind. Goodbye, articulate monsters. Abbott and Costello have met Frankenstein. I am sorry that the conspirators must go, the ones who scared me by showing me a list of all the members of my family. I love the way they reserve judgment about Genghis Khan. So the whole thing is just really puzzling and really dark. And then it's interspersed with Ann Diamond really giving you, pieces of how awful it was to be with him.
Right. The thing that's so fascinating about that Sabbatean cult, and Horsley mentions it, but he says basically what they're trying to do is they're trying to make the world so bad that
it hastens the arrival of the Messiah.
Right.
So it's fine to do evil. Yeah.
So if you look, and especially if you look at that last album, and it's interesting because we played this song a lot at the Alcyon Center, but that You Want It Darker song.
Yeah.
So if you take it and you put it in this kind of a context, it changes the whole song. So what he's not saying, here I am to like make it better. He's saying, here I am to make it darker.
Yeah.
You want it darker, I'll kill the flame.
Well, and that's part of, I think, one of his larger themes in the book is that by the time all this phenomena reaches us as consumers, we don't want sunshine and puppies. We really want anti-heroes, and we
Right.
want violence, and we want sexual violence. And you know, his whole take on the Manson saga is just so interesting, because rather than unravel the figure of Charles Manson, which is a very hard thing to do anyway, given his background and what may have happened to him, he instead looks at Roman Polanski,
Right.
who is a convicted pedophile,
Right.
who made this strange movie, Rosemary's Baby, about a woman who births the devil, and then not a couple years later, his pregnant wife is murdered by, you know, somebody who supposedly said, "I'm the devil and I'm here to do the devil's work." So he's really suggesting something, you know, where art meets art and life become, you know, indistinguishable. You know,
Right.
tabloid stories about these Hollywood figures, the real lives, and the movies, you can't really tease any of it apart.
Right. That's a really fascinating thing that he does with that, with the whole Manson saga, is basically, from what I gathered, is what he's saying is that the way that they portrayed the murders with Manson, essentially what Hollywood was kind of doing was this experiment about what it would be like to just do a movie and not call it a movie, which I think is really fascinating, because then you know, if you kind of take that idea that they were basically seeing if that would work then, and then you take a look at like kind of what's happening and what's been happening for subsequent 60 years, it's they've put us in a position where we can't tell the difference, and as
Right,
far as we're concerned, there isn't one.
right. Or reality is a psyop, or put it this way, there are public events that are psyops that
Right.
are using the very techniques perfected by Hollywood.
Right.
Um, and
So,
so he's kind of building off of a Dave McGowan thing, where McGowan, in his book called about Laurel Canyon, where he shows that, you know, the hippie movement really starts in this little small neighborhood in Hollywood, but located there. It's not a San Francisco phenomenon, and everybody from David Crosby to Frank Zappa to, you know, to Jim Morrison all have military family backgrounds. That's a big theme with a lot of these people. But right in the middle of it was a huge Hollywood studio with all the technology that was used to make propaganda films for the military.
right.
So there's this kind of speculation, maybe a little more than speculation, that counterculture was always at least infiltrated and steered by agents from intelligence. And that's a big theme in all of Horsley's work.
But that's that interesting thing, like what I was talking about early on when he talks about the kind of top-down controllers, but there's the bottom-up counterculture, which we think there really can't be a counterculture, because the minute anything like that pops its head up, it's
Because,
instantly it's instantly commodified.
yeah, that's right. That's really, really, really true. Yeah, so there's something about culture hacking that has to happen right when it is ready to pop.
Right.
It's
And
going to be,
they
yeah.
And nowadays with, I mean, data mining and predictive everything, they know what's about to happen before it's going to happen anyway. So then they can pre-co-opt it before it hits.
Well, that's it. So there's this thing called, he cites, oh, the cybernetics guy. Can never remember his name.
Which one?
The one that was married to Margaret Mead, Bateson, Gregory Bateson,
Yes.
who was running in the same circles as you and Cameron. And he talks about how Bateson's idea of cybernetics is there's both positive feedback and negative feedback. And negative feedback is never disruptive, it just reinforces the status quo. Positive feedback, you introduce it and it creates change. It's
Right.
be the intel or the information that would sort of move the system in a certain direction. And you know, with algorithms now, you can only imagine the kind of power they have of, you know, you introduce this and you get this feedback and that tells you they want some of this, so you add some of this, you know, these advanced reality games, I guess they're calling them. It was funny, I was talking about that to a group I was running, and I had, there was an IT woman in there, and she explained to me that I think it was Dell computers, they don't use that, but Apple uses that explicitly. They literally talk about negative and positive feedback loops. And the funny thing about all this is cybernetics is this kind of, it's kind of like neurolinguistic programming. You know, the culture seems to treat it like it was an artifact of the 60s or something, but it's actually gone on to have quite a life. It's sort of the theoretical basis of a lot of what's going on now.
Right.
So then he starts talking about trauma. Well, he spends a great deal of the book about trauma. And he seems to be able to show how with a traumatized audience, if you've lived a life of trauma, if you've been traumatized and you go to the movie, the narrative that's really compelling for us is the vengeance narrative.
Right.
And so the vengeance narrative, because it by its nature is vengeance, it means the protagonist is going to be an anti-hero.
Right.
You know, so in the French Connection, Popeye Doyle, played by Gene Hackman, has to be a really, really bad man to take on the really bad men.
Right.
Usually talks about Eastwood and the spaghetti westerns where they've got a gang or something they want to get rid of, and they know they need the worst possible gunslinger to do it.
Right.
And so he's saying that when you're traumatized, you have this unassimilable affect that can lead to dissociation and all that. But you know, you have feelings that you can't digest. The shame is so overwhelming, alienates you, and to see someone take vengeance gives you relief from that. You identify with this powerful figure. So he leans heavily on, or his thought anyway, is really, Horsley's informed by Kalshed, who's a Jungian analyst. So do you want to kind of break that down a little bit? Like what's the theoretical construct that Horsley's working with here?
So what Horsley's working with is what Kalshed calls the self-care system, which is a response to trauma, particularly at a very young age. And he plays off of Winnicott, who is another analyst. And basically what Winnicott says at a very young age is when the child cries and is hungry, it imagines the breast. And when the mother gives the child the breast, what it does is it kind of creates, for one, it creates a completed affect cycle. So there's the whole affect, and then not the reward at the end, but it's completion. But it also creates a sense of autonomy in the child because he's imagining something, and then the completion of the imagination creates more space for his world to imagine something else. But what ends up happening is when a child is met with what's called unthinkable or unimaginable trauma, then what that does is it severs the connection between essentially the ego and what Kelsheds calls the essential self or the soul or the child part of that. And then the self-care system kicks in and uses what Kelsheds calls mythopoetic language, which is, he gives an example of a little girl who's supposed to go into her father's study, but the father had had a heart attack and died. So when she was trying to walk in, there was an angel. So she was visualizing, fantasizing that there was an angel there telling her not to go in. And she went back and told her mom, and her mom was like, "That's not real." She tried to go back again. The angel was there again. So what Kelsheds is calling that mythopoetic language is basically the language that your self-care system uses to direct your ego and protect your essential self.
So the angel protects the essential self or the soul from re-traumatizing,
right?
Keeping her out of the study,
right? Well, from essentially experiencing something that has the potential to shatter the soul. So and that's what makes Horsley's work so fascinating, is basically what he's saying is he's saying that even watching movies that are, grotesquely violent, but they put you in a trauma response, whether you're aware of it or not. And if you tie it into the revenge fantasies, what ends up happening is your self-care system ends up gaining a new mythopoetic language, like Dirty Harry or Captain America. And these things start to influence the way that you deal with your trauma, your inability to complete an affect cycle, which is like you get, you get stimulated. So you find yourself in a situation where you don't feel safe, and then your trauma response gets triggered. And instead of being able to know that you're safe and complete the affect cycle, your self-care system will push your soul out of your body. That's the disassociation. And in that, you end up more or less not being in control, but your self-care system is doing what it's been told to do, or what it's designed itself to do, to keep your soul from shattering. And it can become really complicated because it can happen with something as easy as getting into an argument with your wife. And then that whole cycle will kick off. And he actually, towards the end in his I Confess chapter, he talks about having the realization when he gets mad at his wife, Liz, and he begins to realize that what he's actually mad at isn't his wife. And he says things as much as, this is not me, because he'll get into an argument with his wife, and then this part of him will come up that wants to hurt her emotionally.
Yeah.
And that's what Kelsheds would call essentially being taken over by the self-care system. But what the thing that Horsley says, and he starts kind of saying it in Prisoner of Affinity, he gets really into it more in Vice of Kings, and then he talks about it briefly in here, but basically what he says is that self-care system can actually act as a false transcendence. Because when most people talk about a spiritual experience or a religious experience, they talk about a feeling of like a split, like feeling like somebody else, feeling like they're somewhere else, which is the same thing as that happens to you when you disassociate.
Right. Horsley's very big, really not unlike Sardello, in that any spirituality that is causing a disembodiment is probably in this cycle.
Right. So then from that standpoint, what he's kind of saying is, if you're traumatized early on and you ingest a different kind of mythopoetic narrative, because we don't use, we don't use the myths, like we don't have shared stories or myths or anything like that, so there's no real cycle to go through. So like Odysseus goes down to the underworld, he comes back up, he goes back, he reconciles with his wife and all these different things. But like what we have is, we have something bad is happening to a town, so you call in somebody else, they kill everybody, and then the town has to kick them out because they can't have this violent person living in the town.
Yeah.
So those are kind of the way that these self-care systems, for me anyway, and it was so interesting to read his book while reading Kalshed's, and kind of dissect the way that my own trauma response and my self-care system was working, and then to kind of come to the conclusion, which he points to, is that it can get bad enough where your trauma will actually become a false divinity.
Right.
So Kalshed says there's the true God, which turns violence into suffering, and then there's the false God that turns suffering into violence.
Oh God, that's beautiful.
Which I think is really fascinating, and I think it's truly amazing that Horsley was able to do this in such a succinct way, and just showing like everyday culture and cultural experiences, which just build this thing up and up and up.
Yeah. Well, I mean, where there were myths that we lived by, or sacred text, or these narratives, now we get Hollywood instead. So that means somebody has designs on, not is deliberately turning suffering into violence and making a big buck doing it.
Right.
And you've got, especially men, you've got this whole culture of men of various ages that are totally identifying with this. It totally reminds me of some stuff that, I've read about psychopaths, where, especially if you read the narratives of, serial killers, sexual sadists and such, they will talk about committing these crimes, blowing off this incredible amount of energy. Probably, obviously, when you're doing something like that to somebody, when you're exercising that kind of power over somebody, you're not experiencing yourself as a victim. And then they want to stay away from it. They feel bad, whatever. And then they don't do it for a while, but they say something starts building up. And so that's probably because this trauma cycle is never completed. It's still there.
Right.
Build up again until you have to explode. And I don't think you have to be a serial killer to see this kind of thing enacting. Wagner, who's troublesome character in his own right, but he says that's the narcissistic strategy, that you have to make things smaller.
Right.
You have to make things smaller by exercising power over them to release yourself from this unassimilable traumatic affect.
Right. And it seems like, for me anyway, the way that this would manifest would often be when I was asked to be vulnerable or compassionate. So it's kind of, and if you go off of who's the guy in the murder room?
Richard Walter.
Richard Walter's whole intimacy without vulnerability. So that's how you get into a relationship with someone. So there's the intimacy, but your trauma in this particular way, the way that's been programmed, will never actually let you get vulnerable.
Well, in some extreme cases, he really kind of breaks us down in Vice of Kings. It will enrage you.
Exactly.
The vulnerability of the other will actually enrage you.
Yeah.
Which kind of speaks to how so much vice, sexual vice, seems to be people are paying money to be able to violate innocence. Because it's not someone who's consensual, they're not innocent.
Right.
Innocent implies inexperienced and unaware.
And then that way it's all a one-way street.
Yeah, there's no vulnerability on your part. Although to hurt somebody is an intimate thing.
Right. Especially to hurt someone like that.
Yeah. So it's a troubling book. I told him I thought it was a dangerous book.
It is a dangerous book.
Yeah, because I think it certainly will not go unnoticed. It may not be read by many, but it will not go unnoticed.
And I was thinking before we kind of started talking about the difference between rocking the boat and getting people off the boat. I think if you read this book and you can actually begin to see the way that through hypermodernity and neoliberalism, and particularly kind of through this Hollywood quote unquote entertainment vein, the false realities, the alternative realities that you love to live in.
Yeah.
And then you have to start taking a step back from that.
Yeah. Yeah. It's kind of like the drug counselor trying to ruin the addict's using.
Right.
I mean, one of the things that really troubled me about it was I could see very clearly that I don't want to read novels that aren't violent and gritty. I don't want to.
Right.
I don't want to watch TV that isn't.
Right.
So I've been completely taken in by that narrative.
Right. So what does he call? He calls that colonizing.
Yeah.
Yes. Colonized.
The narrative. And what's really interesting is he talks about how after a certain point, this isn't so much, Harvey Weinstein or somebody like that has got his hands on the levers of control. He's saying after a while, once this thing starts going, people are just complicit.
Right. It replicates itself.
It just replicates itself. And he says something really wild about that on page 134, where he goes, he says, simply stated, such sophistication must go far beyond any conscious intent or design, even if this truth is itself factored into the design being intended. Like landscape gardening, culture hacking requires not only a knowledge of the terrain being reshaped and a specific idea about the desired new landscape, but also a familiarity with the indigenous plant and rock life that is the raw material of the new as well as the old landscape. Jesuits train their children from the earliest possible age to become effective adult agents of the ideology informing their training. But if the trainers are also the trained, at what precise point does conspiracy become complicity? What a fabulous question.
Yeah.
And what if the unconscious desire of the trainers to be free of those internal levers of control?
Right.
And then we just read the next one. How literal, tangible, or direct such a legacy of cultural landscaping might be as compared to a subtler, less conscious or intentional influence is difficult, if not possible, to say. Perhaps the now quaint notion of spirits of the land possessing the consciousness of colonizers, as in The Shining, among other horror movies, as a more intangible and less mystical reality. As hinted at in the introduction, it could be that secret societies and their occult practitioners were imported cross-culturally and so entered a high culture phase, assuming a modern, westernized guise via movies, musical performances, award ceremonies, and such like. But even without such speculations, it is becoming apparent that the centrality of Hollywood to the intentional shaping of the cultural collective unconscious can hardly be overestimated. I mean, that made me think the thing about being colonized by the previous inhabitants of this place, of course, that's Weedico,
Right.
Native American idea of this greedy, cannibalistic being that is running amok over America. But then I thought, for me, the most challenging part of this book is Brian Hayden. So Brian Hayden is the one who talks about that this is actually a much older phenomenon.
Oh, the guy who wrote the use of ritual in prehistory?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that the shamans mystify and thereby gain power through the mystification. They gain power through the, for lack of a better term, gullibility of those. They're,
right.
Some of it's real phenomena. And they always present themselves outwardly as benign, but some of the rituals they engage in are, extremely traumatizing to the participants.
Mostly women and children.
Women and children. And the aggrandizers, he calls them.
Right. The influencers.
The influencers. And he's suggesting that this is sort of baked into humanity in a way. And of course, me reading the book, I want to make this all this sort of post-enlightenment, corporate, cut off from the land, unspiritual, what happens, the inevitability of this out of that.
Right. But it kind of puts it on its head if he's talking about this has been around since prehistory.
Sure does. It sure does. One could say that it's, it's that fatal flaw in human nature that most of the religions acknowledge. There's something wrong here. But it really makes me think of all those stories you hear about, people who, they're not gonna drink ayahuasca in the lower 48. They're gonna go to Peru. They're gonna go find a shaman and do it right. And they go down there with all these sort of idealized notions of shamans. And not always, but very often, what do they encounter? Somebody who's avuncular and benign and warm on the front end, but they take things from you.
Right.
Colonize you.
Right.
In effect, you give them your power because they're presenting themselves in such a way. And you think if you follow their directives, you can participate in that kind of power.
Right.
Pretty frightening when you think about it.
It is, and it begs the question. It really begs the question, and I know you just did. You just read that book. What is power? But it really kind of it begs the question. First of all, why would we do that to begin with? And then second of all, is what is it in us that wants that kind of power? Because that's how they, so, according to Hayden, basically he's saying that that's how they maintain their control is through, through small social networks which communicate intertribally. Everybody's kind of on the same page. And then basically, if anybody figures out that the spirits are actually people wearing masks, they're either killed outright or they're ushered in, depending on how, if they have what the group wants. But it's yeah, to think about something, because I, like you, kind of, I thought this was post-enlightenment, neoliberal. This is like the result of what happens when you have an ultra rich class and a peon class and a peasant class, and you trace it back to the the industrial revolution. But to see it as something much older than that does really, it unravels a lot of things.
Yeah,
It really does.
it's I think it's almost like maybe the question isn't why do people want to exercise that kind of power versus a more Girardian, why do we need to believe that there are people who have that kind of power?
Right.
Because, Girard would say, well, that's everyone's seeking that, whether they know it or not. They're seeking the being that seems to have the fullness of being, the plenitude of power. And therefore, if we get close to them, curry favor from them, imitate them, we too can have that kind of power.
But that ends up creating what he calls bad mimesis.
Bad what?
Bad mimesis. That's the bad mimetic desire.
Yeah, that's right. But he says it's endemic.
Right.
We're all participating in it. It kind of seems to go back to Cowshed, because Girard would say that breaking that spell has to do with identifying with the fate of the innocent victim, which would be similar to turning violence into suffering.
Right.
You know.
It brings up this really kind of interesting thing of, in Horsley on page 80, he talks about cryptomnesia, which refers to when we mistakenly believe, when what we mistakenly believe is an original idea that is in fact a memory of something we have previously seen, heard, or read, and we misattribute something to ourselves that has been implanted with us as a self-generated inspiration or insight. Which basically what he's saying is, if you kind of think about technology, you think about media, you think about all these different things, he's saying basically that you can have an idea that you think is yours, but it's a memory that you had of something that somebody else put there. So there was a whole movie about it, Inception. They're incepting an idea into you. And if you kind of take this idea that Hayden has, that these kind of societies and these rituals have been around, since time immemorial, then at some point in your life, whether you're aware of it or not, you've seen something like this, or heard or read about something like this, even if it was a cartoon and you didn't know what you were looking at, but there was a bunch of, or even that Hitchcock movie that he talks about. It was a short movie, but it was like, there's a scene in that movie which doesn't have anything to do with the rest of the movie, and it's essentially it's this ritual where there's a bunch of people cloaked and they're doing this thing at this tablet. So it's that kind of deep programming is really interesting to me, especially if you've been traumatized and you're disassociated and you're really, really susceptible to being programmed in that kind of a fashion. It's what Sheds doesn't come right out and call it this, but he talks about the daemon of the self-care system, and then he talks about trauma trance, which is you can actually be traumatized. So if I don't know if you've ever been in a car accident or seen someone who's been in a car accident, or like seen someone who got beat up really bad, but people call it shock, which I'm sure medically is what you could call it. But if you've seen somebody like that, they're very odd. They're confused, and not just from not from being concussed, but they're just like if you fall down really hard unexpectedly and you stand up, and you're kind of like, at first you're going to run, but then afterwards you're really kind of you're in
You're suspended.
you're right, you're in an altered state. So basically what Kalsheds is kind of pointing at without saying it is that you can actually be daemonically programmed, not demonically programmed, but like the daemon is in the way that the Jungians use it, which is kind of the way I understand it is a specific manifestation of a particular archetype.
Yeah, yeah.
So
So he's saying that all these little memes can get put in there through seemingly benign pop cultural artifacts, songs and TV shows and so on and so forth. But then when actual trauma happens, it goes into a certain pre-formed pattern.
exactly. So then essentially your trauma response and your self-care system, your self-care daemon has a whole litany of shapes and forms and narratives and judgments all stored up. And then when they get turned on like that, they essentially download all that kind of programming.
I think that's just genius, because many of us, maybe most of the people listening to this, and we experience a trauma, we don't have a kind of culture where we can go be nursed.
Right.
Instead, we have one where you don't know where to go with it, and you're frozen in that state. And so immediately you start getting these downloads around, if you're a man anyway, around vengeance.
Right. And it's interesting. Go ahead. Sorry.
Go ahead.
It's interesting that you brought up the word frozen, because for me anyway, that was kind of what it felt like. It felt like being stuck, frozen in this place. Not, this is kind of making reference to the paper, but I won't get into it too deeply, but it's it's being frozen in this in-between place. And when Kelsheds talks about, because in Trauma and the Soul, he kind of breaks down the inferno, and he talks about the ninth layer of hell being frozen. But what he says is he says that people are frozen, imagistically in ice. But what he says is the ninth layer is frozen because there are people who cannot be moved.
Yeah.
Which is fascinating.
One of our friends recently told me that she said shame can't do company.
Right.
So if you've been traumatized or victimized in such a way that it arouses all this shame, that when you are in that, when you're feeling that, you can't break out of that. You can't share that with anybody. And even if you manage to talk about it, you're still left with this, I'm worse than they are, I deserve this, they think I'm weird, whatever. So it's a frozen state, but it's also, I think it's important that it's a frozen state that's essentially alone.
Right.
But then if you've got all these downloads of Clint Eastwood and Charles Bronson and Hannibal Lecter and such, you you have a fantasy pattern to go with that is actually shared by the people around you.
Right.
That's what's interesting. So it's got a cultural acceptance. It's normative, maybe criminal, but it's still normative.
Well, it's a bond. It's that. Yeah, that's really fascinating. So it's easier for me, and if I think about it, and particularly like in my life as a teenager, and now even more so with people who were close to me, were supposed to be in my family, we end up talking about movies, and like because I ingested a lot of media content like as a child and pretty much my whole life. Lately, it's been less just because I don't have time. But one of the ways that I found when I was an adolescent that I could communicate best with my friends was if we started to talk about movies, particular characters, particularly emotionally evocative scenes, but I couldn't tell them how shitty my childhood was, but I could talk to them about this scene. So
Right.
it's this, right.
We could share cinematic horror together.
Right.
Yeah.
And that would kind of count as a catharsis or like,
Yeah.
but it wouldn't because you can never.
Yeah.
Right.
It never takes you to it never gets you turning our violence into suffering.
Right.
Yeah. So with addiction, we have, without getting into who's the puppet master, you have an environment that's creating massive trauma, stress, and dislocation. So people are feeling alone. They're feeling afraid. They're feeling awful. And there's something I think about addiction, not that it leaves the cinematic means behind or anything, but there's something about addiction that the getting high and the visceral, powerful release from the affect in the getting high is I think it's even more powerful.
Well, it kicks that self-care system offline. So the way that my self-care system in particular manifests is through like extreme judgment. I judge, before when I wasn't high, it was a constant litany of judgment. Look at that person at the grocery store. Why is that idiot driving like that? And you get more and more, but there was always that underlying violence beneath it. So it's this, I'm a dislocated, angry, traumatized kid trying to make it in the world. And the only response that I have to basically every single interaction is judgment and anger. So, but I found when I got high, that process kicked off.
You just stopped.
Just stopped.
Yeah, that's right. Kind of like the reveling and I don't give a fuck.
Right.
I don't care.
I was actually a much nicer person.
Mm. Me too. So there's the trauma, there's the unassimilable affect, and then there is the release from that by getting high, which still in a way is ultimately turning suffering into violence.
Right.
And now it's violence directed on my own
So,
person.
right. Because it's still disassociation.
Right. And I can remember in my active addiction having thoughts like, people were getting mad at me about what I was doing. And I was like, well, I can remember thinking things like this. Well, at least I'm not doing it to you.
Right.
Don't you understand? I need to do this so I'm not an asshole to you.
Right.
Of course, normal people don't understand that logic, but you talk to any addict and they get it. If I have to go to the wedding, you have to let me get high.
Exactly.
Otherwise, I'm just going to be horrible to be with.
Right.
Trying to be a jerk. I don't really have a choice here. Yeah.
And that's recognizing, and it's really interesting to recognize that split without, so you can say that, and that's a perfect example, is I'll go do this thing, but I have to get high, because if I don't, I'm going to be someone I don't want to be.
You don't want me to be.
Right. Right.
Yeah. That's really crazy that you can have that kind of insight. And I would say that's a fairly universal insight amongst drug addicts and alcoholics. And yet you can't really make any sense of it.
Right.
Just know that it is. You don't know why that it is. And there's something that's really interesting because there is some sort of taboo against knowing why it is. And it's not just a taboo that you're not aware of enforcing it on yourself, but it's a taboo that's actually enforced by the society that has a vested interest in not seeing it.
Right.
Certainly in the treatment world, you can see this very explicitly. They'll make abstract reference to addiction being related to trauma, but they would never get into it to the degree that our conversation just did. They're not going to break it down in such a way that the addict's like, oh, hell, yeah, I can work with that. And then you have a pharmaceutical industry that's really about taking doing essentially what drugs do, just differently, different drugs, taking the edge off the affect.
Right. The other interesting thing about the way that psychopharmaceuticals and the mental health industry works is if you begin to have insight about that, like I did when I was in prison, and being able to be like, to say to a counselor, when this thing happens, it doesn't feel like me. Well, then now I get a whole new slew of diagnoses, and I get a medication instead of having someone with the forethought and the experience and the expanse of consciousness to be like, because if someone had said to me, well, if it's not you, who is it? Or why?
Just
How do you
opening it to a dialogue?
Right, just to begin to unpack that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Questioning it actually leads to more labeling.
Right.
Or sometimes we'll tell people the truth about what's going on. Well, we scare them into giving us another diagnosis, which is basically what you just said. Yeah.
Well, it flies in the face of that whole the recent critique that we were talking about the kind of the traditional AA way you tell your story. Right. So I was a good kid. I went to a good school, so on and so forth. I met these friends. Boom. This, I made this choice. This happened. But it's such a different story if I grew up, I had a traumatic experience, and then to begin to understand that through that traumatic experience, the disassociation, my ability to be programmed, the self-care system, then the conversation becomes, I had a traumatic event, and now there's a trauma response that is more powerful than my ego. And it's so powerful that it's gotten to the point where my ego identifies it as a god.
Mm-hmm.
So when I have a disassociation or a dissociative experience, what it's actually akin to, as far as my ego and my essence and my soul is concerned, it's actually worship.
Oh yeah, and I think, you know, in a slightly different vein, Jung's very on top of that.
Yeah.
Because he's saying that drugs and alcohol are a kind of transcendence.
Right.
If what we're saying is true, then they are a trauma dressed up in sensual whatever pleasure. Yeah. So they're really a disguised trauma as a transcendence. I mean, I think that Dunnington is really, he's unwittingly working, well, not unwittingly, he just hasn't gone down this road. But when he says that there are moral goods in addiction,
Right.
that, you know, he just cites, you know, all the stories in AA or in the big book where I'm 13 years old and it all started when we raided Dad's liquor cabinet and I got in trouble and vomited everywhere, but I knew I'd do it again. Well, the real question is, wait a minute. Why are you going to do it again? You got sick and you got in trouble. It sounds like that was far more outweighed whatever fleeting sensual pleasure you got. But the truth is you got belonging and you broke out of the alienation and the shame. And so that's the whole self-care thing.
Right. It puts you in a situation at 13 years old where you and your buddies can actually sit down and feel close to each other for the first time in who knows how long.
Yeah.
Because you're no longer working, you're no longer being worked over by this trauma response, which is designed to keep you invulnerable.
Yeah. Yeah. So then it means that what we don't have in society are, we have people that label and treat symptoms or tell you to man up, but we don't have people who have the skill set to turn the violence into suffering.
Right.
Be there with you through that. And yet we do know through human history, well, there are and there always have been people who are capable of doing that. But the vocations where you should be doing that, the therapist, the doctor, the clergy, the rabbi, the priest, they seem not able to do that anymore. And I think some of that's training, but I also think it has never happened with them.
Right.
It was never part of their initiation into the vocation of healing. I guess one of the things I'm left wondering is, I mean, I think I already have the answer, but you know, what's so interesting about ideas like this or dislocation theory is you finally have this sort of massive or Hollywood context to put this stuff in.
Right.
And is that absolutely necessary to the project of turning violence into suffering?
For me, it is. That was the turning point. That was what, when I first, when I met you at Hollowell, that was the thing that you spoke truth to it. Because I had this loose, I can remember being 19 and talking to someone in county jail who was like on this medication for depression or whatever, and I remember saying to him, I'd be like, don't you think your brain is trying to fix itself? So what do you think this medication's going? And like, so I had all these kind of loose ideas on my own, And then when they got bundled in that overarching kind of meta-analysis, it changed everything. Because it made it so it broke the, so it broke the VR simulation. Because it made me take a step back and then another step back and all these kind of layers of alternative and false reality that I was living in, that I knew deep down, I could feel it, that it wasn't right, but I didn't know how to get out of it. But when you start applying this kind of analysis, it pushes you out. It makes it, you can either, let me put it this way, it makes it way harder to live the lie.
Yeah, I can see how it makes it so you can't live it in anymore. But I guess, and I agree with you. I would answer my own question the same way. But I guess my next question then becomes, it would seem that it's imperative then that there's a community of people who are exploring this together.
Yeah.
Because then if it's only you with it, or you and some guy who told you about it, then it can actually create another layer of alienation, because
It becomes special.
well, you think you're special, but no one knows what the hell you're talking about. Yeah. Which is, really problematic. Well, I think we did justice to Jason. I'll send this to him, doesn't mean he'll watch it.
I'd like to have a conversation with him.
Well, maybe we can do that. Yeah. Any final thoughts? Anything you think we should have touched on that we didn't?
Well, I thought the idea, and we kind of did in a roundabout way, but I thought the idea of the Latha, is, I don't know how you say, the Latha.
I don't say it either. Yeah.
Yeah, basically the cultural bondage piece I thought was really, really fascinating, and the way that he kind of ties it into the idea of the Joker from the Batman movies, and then he ties it into the mass shooting that happened in Aurora. But basically what he says is, an idea is kind of put out there, and then when the idea gets enough attention, it ends up taking on an autonomous life of its own.
Mm-hmm.
And then that idea, in particular the Joker, but if we could use Clint Eastwood, or we could use Captain America, or a really fascinating one is Hannibal Lecter, why everybody loves Hannibal Lecter.
Yeah.
But this idea ends up taking on an autonomous life of its own, and it jumps person to person. So you could even think about Bob in
Twin Peaks.
But it becomes cultural bondage in the sense that the only way that me and my friends could talk about anything even remotely intimate was to use pop culture references.
Yeah.
So yeah.
It's deeply fascinating. And there's this, if you don't understand the mechanism of it, so that What Is Power book, he says ideas are far more powerful than violence, because violence always creates pushback, but
Right.
ideas have the ability to do what you just described, to move, and they get stronger the more people participate in them. But then I think they get even more powerful still when I either believe that it's my idea, or in this case, it's my taste, or we share we're cool because we're bonded together because we share the same taste. And that's still, you know, I think one of the hardest things about this kind of research is that it's really showing you how manipulated you are.
Right.
And how maybe now, maybe always, I don't know, but how spiritual or psychological health is dependent on your own, you taking your own deprogramming in hand, which starts with the assumption that I'm programmed. You know, that's, to me, that's a really hard one, because I can say you're programmed, but yeah, I'm too smart for that.
Right.
All right, sir. Well,
All right. That was a lot of fun.
Yep. 16 Maps of Hell.
Right.
You're
Go
not
buy it. Read it.
going to find it at Walmart.
No. Help Jason out.
I'm going to find it in hell. All right. Have a good night.
You too.
Thank you.